Support is not a human default, self-interest is. This single realization saves you from years of confusion, resentment, and emotional exhaustion. Human beings are not wired to respond with generosity as their first instinct. They are wired to scan for advantage, risk, and how a situation affects their own position. If your success affirms someone else's identity or comfort, they will clap. If your success threatens their relevance, exposes their stagnation, or shifts the hierarchy they benefit from, they will quietly withdraw their support or actively undermine you. This is not a moral failure of humanity, it is a structural truth of social life. History, workplaces, families, friendships, politics. Everywhere you look, you'll find that allegiance tends to follow advantage, not principle. People support what protects them, elevates them, or attaches them to the rewards of being near you once you have already proven yourself. Before that stage, most of what you will face is neutrality, skepticism, or subtle resistance disguised as advice, caution, or concern. If you misunderstand this truth, you will misinterpret normal human behavior as betrayal. You will take silence personally. You will think the absence of support means the absence of worth. You will dilute your ambition in order not to make others uncomfortable, hoping that if you shrink enough, they will love you more. But support is not the currency that precedes achievement, it is the currency that chases achievement. People rarely support what is unproven because support is an investment, and investment requires a belief that a return is likely. Most people do not have the imagination to see a return before it exists. They need evidence. They need safety. They need confirmation that backing you will not make them look foolish or cost them socially, economically, or emotionally. So they wait, they observe, they do nothing until doing something is safe. Look at every major innovator, dissenter, reformer, or builder. Their earliest seasons are defined by isolation, mockery, dismissal, or invisibility. They built without a chorus. They acted before the consensus shifted. They were loyal to the logic of their mission, not the volume of external approval. Meanwhile, the world around them behaved predictably. People guarded their own interests, protected their existing beliefs, and resisted whatever threatened their structure of comfort. This is why expecting support is a misunderstanding of how human systems operate. You are asking people to make your interest their priority without incentive, without proof, and without payoff. That expectation is not only unrealistic, it makes you emotionally fragile. The moment you require others to believe in advance, you give them veto power over your evolution. Once you accept that self interest is the baseline, you free yourself. You stop waiting for cheerleaders before you begin. You stop interpreting silence as a signal to quit. You stop designing a life that requires external fuel to run. Instead, you begin to operate from internal legitimacy, a commitment derived from reasoned conviction, not external applause. That shift is the birth of adult ambition. When you no longer need support to continue, you become dangerous in the best sense, ungoverned by approval, uninterruptible by doubt, and unattracted to the narcotics of validation. You do not chase alignment from others, you build momentum until alignment becomes advantageous for them. That is when support arrives, not as a gift of loyalty, but as a response to outcomes. Understanding self interest also protects you from naive optimism about relationships. You stop assuming that people will reciprocate effort just because you were generous first. Reciprocity is not a law, it is a choice conditioned by incentive. The friend you help may not help you if helping you compromises them. The colleague you trained may not advocate for you if your promotion threatens theirs. The family member who praises you privately may never celebrate you publicly if their identity depends on you staying small. This is not cruelty, it is calculus. They are choosing themselves the same way you must learn to choose yourself when your path has no audience. This recognition is not a call to cynicism, it is a call to clarity. When you see the world as it is instead of how you wish it to be, you navigate it without emotional illusion. You stop moralizing normal behavior and start building strategies around it. You stop begging for encouragement and build systems that make encouragement unnecessary. And you stop equating lack of support with lack of destiny. In fact, the absence of support in the early phase is diagnostic data. It tells you you are crossing into territory others have not entered, which is precisely where original outcomes are born. The task is not to change human nature, but to adjust your expectations so you are no longer destabilized by it. Expect self interest, and you are no longer shocked by silence. Expect neutrality, and you are no longer dependent on reassurance. Expect resistance, and you develop a spine instead of resentment. Then you build, not because others push you, but because stopping would violate your own logic. That is the psychological adulthood of ambition, moving without permission, persisting without witnesses, and creating a world that only makes sense to others once you have already built it. You said, silence around you does not equal a verdict against you expended in 750 words without heading. ChatGPT said silence around you does not equal a verdict against you. The absence of praise, recognition, or visible encouragement is not a ruling that your work is worthless. It is simply the default condition of doing anything that has not yet produced visible returns. People do not typically applaud potential, they applaud outcomes. And between the starting line and the proof of outcome, there is usually a long corridor of quiet. If you misread that quiet as rejection, you will sabotage your own trajectory long before external reality has a chance to confirm or deny its value. Silence is not a message, it is a vacuum waiting to be filled by results. But many people fill that vacuum with their worst insecurities. They assume doubt where no one has spoken. They imagine mockery where no one has reacted. They interpret neutral quiet as negative judgment. This internal misinterpretation does more damage than any critic could. Your nervous system is trained by repetition. If you repeatedly label silence as disapproval, you train yourself to hesitate, stall, and downplay ambition anytime you are not instantly validated. That is how good ideas died, not through attack, but through misread neutrality. Consider how often history rewards the person who kept walking in silence. The early months and years of nearly any worthwhile build, a business, a transformation, a study path, a skill, a reinvention, occur without witnesses. There is nothing for others to see yet. People don't cheer at foundations, they cheer at skylines. In the meantime, they move on with their lives. Their silence is not an indictment, it is simply a sign that they are occupied with their own interests. We wrongly assume others are watching us more than they are. Most people are not analyzing your path. They are absorbed in their own worries, debts, plans, and insecurities. The silence you interpret as judgment is often nothing more than people minding their own reality. Even when people do notice your movement, silence can come from uncertainty, not disapproval. When people don't know whether your path will succeed, they withhold reaction. Support has a cost: social, emotional, reputational. People delay that cost until they see whether the bet is safe, so their silence is not a verdict, it is risk management. If you collapse in the quiet stage, they will feel justified in withholding. If you endure the quiet stage, their support will appear later, as if it had always been there. But its arrival tells you nothing about your original value, only about their threshold for risk. Silence is also a psychological test. It forces you to determine whether you act from conviction or from dependency on applause. If your momentum dies the moment no one is watching, you were not driven, you were performing. Quiet phases expose the truth of your motive. They strip away the sugar of social approval and leave you with one question: do you still move when no one affirms the motion? Those who continue in that condition cultivate something stronger than support. They cultivate internal authority. Each day they act without applause. They strengthen the muscle of self trust. By the time results arrive and the world begins to speak, they no longer need that speech to continue. Misreading silence can also inflict relational damage. Some people fall into resentment and bitterness toward others simply because they expected vocal support at an early stage. They assume absence of comment means concealed hostility. They label people unsupportive when in fact those people were just neutral. That resentment then poisons relationships unnecessarily and makes the builder more isolated, not by circumstance but by misinterpretation. Clarity is protection. Understanding that silence is not a sentence frees you from inventing enemies that do not exist. There is a deeper lesson: the world does not announce validation in advance. You cannot live as though the verdict must come before the work. The verdict, if one is ever given, comes after persistence, after proof, after endurance. Expecting the reverse is like demanding a harvest before planting seeds. The quiet phase is not a sign that you are failing, it is the natural beginning of every serious undertaking. The people who succeed are not those who are loudly supported at the start, they are those who learn to generate motion without external sound. They built under the pressure of ambiguity without needing the world to narrate their worth. If you can emotionally de-link silence from rejection, you reclaim enormous psychological power. You stop trying to decode other people's reactions. You stop halting your life until someone else nods. You stop surrendering your speed to the tempo of other people's words. You work because the logic of the work demands completion, not because an audience is clapping. Then, when sound eventually arrives, praise, commentary, endorsement, or imitation, it arrives as an echo, not a fuel source. Silence was never the verdict. It was simply the runway before lift. You said the world rewards outcomes, not the loneliness required to produce them. Expend it in 750 words without heading, ChatGPT said. The world rewards outcomes, not the loneliness required to produce them. This truth is harsh only if you expect applause while you are still building. The hours you spend studying when everyone else sleeps, the days you spend misunderstood because you chose a path others cannot see, the habits you impose on yourself that no one witnesses, none of that is compensated at the time you're enduring it. The world does not pay you for the years you carried self doubt, it pays you for the visible result of having endured it. By the time people celebrate you, you are far beyond the stage when you needed celebration. The cheering is retroactive, a delayed echo that arrives after you no longer need it for fuel. There is something structurally important about this. If society rewarded effort without outcome, people could receive recognition merely for trying rather than for transforming. The gap between struggle and recognition filters out those whose ambition collapses in the absence of approval. Anyone can fantasize in crowds, very few can build in isolation. The loneliness phase is a sorting mechanism, a pressure chamber that exposes whether your drive is internal or merely dependent on witnesses. If you crumble without validation, you never make it to the stage where validation arrives. The world, in that way, is brutally consistent. It demands that you carry the burden privately before it grants the reward publicly. Consider how people respond to success stories. They admire the end state, the finished book, the profitable business, the transformed body, the reputation, the competence. But rarely do they admire the invisible mornings of discipline, the anxiety of risk, the repeated failures, the discouragement swallowed silently, the uncertainty that no one else could absorb for you. They marvel at the product but are indifferent to the price. And that is precisely why you cannot construct your emotional stability on public encouragement. The world does not validate the process because the process is not glamorous. It is slow, repetitive, sacrificial, and unphotographable. It doesn't entertain spectators, so it remains unseen. If you wrongly assume you are owed recognition for the lonely phase, you weaken yourself. You begin to resent the very silence that is shaping your endurance. You confuse invisibility with insignificance. You start negotiating with your ambition, telling yourself, if no one notices, maybe it doesn't matter. But the lack of attention is not evidence of futility, it is evidence of the stage you are in. Results produce attention, not the hours before the results exist. There is no cruelty in that. There is simply sequence. The problem is not that the world ignores you, the problem is expecting it not to. Expecting recognition during incubation is like expecting applause when all you have is blueprint. People do not reward what they cannot see or measure. The loneliness of the making phase is not a flaw in life design. It is the cost of sovereignty. It is the time when you live without external confirmation, when you build your identity on output rather than audience. By walking through that corridor without witnesses, you become psychologically independent. That independence is the real reward of the lonely phase, greater even than the recognition that comes later. And notice something else is when the outcome finally appears, people reinterpret the past. They retroactively claim they believed in you. They speak as though they supported you all along. They attach themselves to the finished narrative to borrow dignity from the result without paying any of the loneliness it required. This is why chasing early support is foolish. Support is not a prepayment, it is a response to proof. It arrives when the cost is gone and the risk is gone. In that sense, expecting support early is asking people to incur emotional risk when most humans are biologically risk averse. They wait for certainty, and certainty exists only after the lonely work is done. The correct psychological stance is to treat the lonely phase as part of the price of admission. You do not resent it, you factor it. You do not wait for applause, you anticipate its absence. You do not assume that the world rejecting your process means the process is wrong. You assume the opposite, that if the process truly requires loneliness, it is likely a process that leads somewhere others have not reached yet. Anything that produces rare outcomes must pass through conditions that most people refuse to tolerate. Loneliness is one of those conditions. So the task is not to eliminate loneliness, but to metabolize it into leverage, to use the silence as a forge rather than a signal to stop. When you accept that the world rewards outcomes, not effort, and certainly not the quiet agony that precedes them, you free yourself from the emotional misconception that you are failing simply because no one is watching. You are not failing, you are pre-visible. You are not dismissed. You are unproven. You are not ignored. You are still incubating. The world will show up at the harvest, not the planting. Your job is to plant anyway, repeatedly, relentlessly, without witnesses, until what was once invisible becomes undeniable. You said, opposition is proof you are disrupting an equilibrium expended in 750 words without heading. ChatGPT said, opposition is proof you are disrupting an equilibrium. Systems, whether social, economic, familial, cultural, or psychological, defend themselves when disturbed. People do not resist what leaves their reality unchanged. They resist what threatens the existing order from which they draw stability, identity, or benefit. So when pushback appears, it is not necessarily a sign of error. More often, it is a sign that your movement has force. You are not being fought because you are wrong. You are being fought because you are consequential. Harmless efforts draw indifference, not resistance. Any structure, once established, fights to preserve itself. That is true of habits inside you, hierarchies around you, and expectations placed upon you. The moment you attempt to replace habit with discipline, stagnation with growth, silence with assertion, or dependence with autonomy, you activate friction. That friction is not a warning to stop, it is verification that you have begun to move in a way that matters. You are pressing against an equilibrium that has been comfortable for others, even if it has been suffocating for you. Your improvement threatens their arrangement, whether that arrangement is circumstantial or psychological. People oppose not only because they dislike your direction, but because your direction changes the terms of their place in relation to you. If you gain strength, they lose the advantage of your weakness. If you gain clarity, they lose the comfort of your confusion. If you gain boundaries, they lose access to your compliance. Growth is not neutral, it redistributes power. That redistribution is what people subconsciously resist. They are not reacting to your dream or your plan. They are reacting to the shift in gravitational pull that your evolution creates. Opposition also emerges from cognitive discomfort. When you embody a path that others were too afraid or too undisciplined to choose, your existence becomes a mirror they did not request. Instead of confronting their avoidance, they attempt to mute the mirror by doubting you, dismissing you, or discouraging you. That is not about you. That is a defensive maneuver to protect their self concept. It is far easier to convince themselves you will fail than to confront the possibility that they could have chosen differently. Their resistance is a psychological shield, not a rational verdict. You must also understand that equilibrium is reinforced not only by individuals but by environments. Institutions, peer networks, family structures, they all have unwritten codes designed to keep behavior predictable. When you deviate from those codes, they react as a body. They send signals: sarcasm, warning, ridicule, guilt, withdrawal, questioning. These are not random responses, they are regulatory tools used to push you back into conformity. If you interpret these reactions as evidence that you should retreat, you return the system to comfort and betray the very change you were attempting to enact. If instead you interpret opposition as structural feedback that you are altering the equation, the resistance becomes data, not deterrent. Look historically, every reform, every invention, every reversal of a dominant narrative encountered opposition precisely because it destabilized someone's certainty or privilege. Resistance has always been the first stamp on any attempt to rewire reality. The idea that real change would come with unanimous applause is a fantasy marketed by those who never attempted real change. The actual pattern is conflict first, recognition later. The world resists what challenges it and then retroactively praises what withstands its resistance. Psychologically, opposition also serves you. It forces you to clarify your reasons, strengthen your arguments, refine your strategy, and deepen your resolve. Without pushback, your conviction stays soft. With pushback, it must become structural. In that sense, opposition is not only proof that you are disrupting equilibrium, it is part of the process that forges the capability to sustain the disruption once it becomes reality. Resistance trains resilience. The crucial mistake people make is assuming that opposition signals misdirection. Sometimes it does, but far more often it signals novelty, threat, and momentum. You do not receive fire for standing still, you receive fire for advancing. The correct question when you meet resistance is not, why is this happening? But what equilibrium is this movement threatening? That lens converts frustration into comprehension. You stop personalizing what is structural. You stop negotiating with people who benefit from your stasis. You stop retreating at the first sign of discomfort and begin to recognize discomfort as the shadow of transformation. Opposition is not the enemy, passivity is. Opposition means you have initiated a shift that reality is trying to reverse. That is precisely the moment you must not fold. If the equilibrium snaps back, all you did was disturb, not transform. Transformation requires sustaining the disruption long enough for the new pattern to consolidate. So when resistance arrives, treat it not as a stop sign, but as confirmation that you are crossing the boundary where most people turn back. Others quit at the threshold. You continue through it. That continuation is what converts disruption into destiny. You said resilience is learned by building without witnesses, expended in 750 words without heading. ChatGPT said, resilience is learned by building without witnesses. You do not develop endurance in the presence of applause, you develop it in the absence of it. When no one is looking, no one is praising, no one is validating, and you continue anyway, that is when your psychological spine grows. Most people assume resilience is a trait you are born with, but it is a skill carved in the seasons when you work without being seen. It is in the unobserved repetitions, the uncelebrated attempts, the unnoticed persistence that you train your nervous system to continue in the absence of reward. Public pressure tests your performance. Private isolation builds your capacity. When there are witnesses, there are incentivist reputation, approval, admiration, or fear of embarrassment. These external forces can push a person forward even when their internal drive is weak. But that is not resilience, that is dependence on observation. True resilience is forged when none of those forces exist, when the only thing that carries you forward is conviction. When you wake up and do the work without an audience, you sever your progress from the need for recognition. You build autonomy of commitment. You teach yourself to move from reason, not reaction. Most people fail not because the work is impossible, because they cannot tolerate the quiet phase where nothing appears to be happening, nothing is being acknowledged, and nothing is feeding their ego. They begin to believe that if no one sees it, it doesn't matter. They stop because they misinterpret invisibility as irrelevance. But invisibility is not irrelevance, it is incubation. The roots of anything strong grow underground before anything breaks the surface. The soil stage is always silent. The fact that others cannot see what you are building does not mean it is not being built. It means you are still in the phase where resilience is being trained. There is a psychological purification that happens in solitude. When you work without witnesses, you confront the real reasons you move. You can no longer pretend that you are motivated by mission if you collapse the moment applause disappears. Solitude exposes whether you are pursuing growth for its own sake or merely for social attention. Many are not in love with mastery, they are in love with being seen attempting mastery. The lonely phase burns that false motive away. What remains after that burning is commitment that is not conditional on visibility. Resilience built in private also protects you later when circumstances tighten or criticism arrives. If you have trained yourself to continue without applause, you are not destabilized when applause fades. If you have learned to persist without validation, you are not derailed when validation is withheld. If you have spent seasons moving in silence, you are not paralyzed by noise, whether that noise is praise or attack. You become untouchable in the most important way. Your motion is no longer hostage to external conditions. Building without witnesses also strengthens your tolerance for delayed gratification. You experience the long gap between investment and outcome with no one affirming that the delay is worth it. That gap is where many quit because they misinterpret delay as defeat. Those who survive that gap develop a rare psychological advantage. They become capable of long term action without immediate reinforcement. That capability is the foundation of every long range success, from academic mastery to business building to personal reinvention. Without the ability to withstand the desert of visibility, you never reach the oasis of results. There is another reason why resilience grows in solitude, because there is no one to absorb your uncertainty for you. When you work alone, you must metabolize your own doubt, regulate your own fear, self correct your own errors, and supply your own momentum. You become the engineer of your perseverance instead of outsourcing that function to approval or companionship. That internal engineering is what makes you durable. You stop collapsing under pressure because you have rehearsed survival without external support. Later, when your work becomes visible, people will misread your resilience as confidence you always had. They will not see the nights you continued with no witnesses, no feedback, and no measurable payoff. But those nights are precisely why you can now withstand exposure. Public achievement is just the visible residue of private resilience. The world sees the fruit, it never sees the roots. But the roots are where the strength was made. So do not curse the seasons where no one is watching. Those seasons are not empty, they are formative. They are the gym where your persistence is lifted against the weight of silence. They are the training grounds that make you immune to external permission. They are the furnace in which dependence burns away and self trust is minted. If you can build without witnesses, you are no longer fragile. You are now capable of continuing when others stop, and that is what makes you unstoppable. You said, your task is not to recruit cheerleaders, Your task is to generate results. Expend it in 750 words without heading, ChatGPT said. Your task is not to recruit cheerleaders. Your task is to generate results. The moment you shift your energy from building to convincing, you leak power. Trying to persuade people to believe in you before you have proof is a diversion. It drains time, emotion, and focus away from the work that would make belief unnecessary. People are not converted by your promise, they are converted by your performance. You do not argue your way into credibility, you produce your way into it. The world does not align around intention, it aligns around evidence. Chasing cheerleaders reveals a deeper insecurity, the need for reassurance before committing fully. You want others to validate your direction so you can feel safe while walking it. But if you require that safety, you will never build anything exceptional. Safety is a luxury that comes only after results exist. Before results, you are meant to walk without witnesses, without guarantees, and without applause. That is the price of autonomy. Recruiting support prematurely is an attempt to lower that price by outsourcing emotional risk to others. But people will not co-sign a vision you have not yet substantiated. They will wait, watch, and only enter once the outcome is visible. When you prioritize support, you alter your behavior to secure approval. You adapt your decisions to fit the comfort of spectators instead of the demands of the mission. You begin shaping your path to be palatable instead of correct. That is how ambition gets domesticated. Every time you look sideways to see who is clapping, you look away from the work that would earn the clap. The highest achievers do not waste time convincing anyone. They understand that results are the only persuasive language people truly respect. Results do something that speeches, explanations, and defensive arguments never can. They silence doubt without confrontation. People do not question what is undeniable. Once the outcome is real, even those who ignored, mocked, or dismissed you must recalibrate around it. You do not need them to cheer. You simply need to remove their ability to deny. Results force recognition, even from those who refuse admiration. The world does not owe you validation for your effort, it responds to your effect. The hunger for cheerleaders also reveals a misunderstanding of human nature. People support what benefits them or what signals safety. They do not invest belief where there is only risk. They will withhold praise until joining you is cost free. And once success is achieved, they often rewrite history and claim they believed the entire time. That is why seeking praise support is foolish. The same people who ignore you now will claim you later. But that delayed allegiance teaches you something critical. Support is not something you win by asking, it is something you attract by building. Focusing on results requires tolerating a long period with no external reinforcement. That is where most people quit. The ones who keep going become rare, not because they are gifted, but because they trained themselves to move without emotional subsidy. When you stop trying to recruit belief and start producing undeniable outcomes, you exit the psychological dependency that traps the majority. You become governed by execution, not by reaction. Results are also honest. Cheerleaders can be enthusiastic and still useless. A room full of encouragement cannot move your project 1 inch. Results, however, restructure reality. They open doors, shift leverage, alter hierarchies, and create options. Influence is not the reward for being liked, it is the reward for being effective. When you generate results, you become difficult to ignore, difficult to replace, and difficult to dismiss. Your energy is finite. Every unit you spend persuading others is a unit you did not spend producing. Build first, explain later, if at all. Outcomes make your argument for you. And once you have outcomes, you no longer care whether anyone claps. You no longer chase validation because your work has made you independent of it. That is the psychological liberation. When the scoreboard speaks, you do not need cheerleaders. You no longer need anyone to believe. The result has already made belief irrelevant.